So we're diving into this book, The Unseen Damage. It's tackling a subject that's causing a lot of buzz online, the real impact of modern feminism. And given your interest in things like covert contracts and how societal institutions have evolved, I think you'll find this deep dive particularly relevant.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting about this book is the author's approach. He combines personal observations, interviews, and some really deep research to kind of paint a picture of how feminism has influenced so many things, from family dynamics to global birth rates. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from the tough questions, that's for sure. So to give us some context, can you walk us through how feminism has evolved over time, from its early forms to what we see today?
Absolutely. So the early feminist movements, like the suffragettes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were really focused on securing those basic rights for women, like the right to vote.
Right, and those were really foundational steps.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And then came the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s,
Right.
advocating for equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to discrimination. These movements aim to create a level playing field in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And I think it's important to acknowledge the progress that was made during these periods.
Oh, for sure.
But the author argues that as feminism entered the 21st century, a kind of shift occurred.
Okay, interesting.
He contends that modern feminism, particularly with the rise of social media, has become more focused on highlighting what it perceives as the oppression of women by men.
So he's not dismissing the positive aspects of these movements, but suggesting there might be unintended consequences as well.
Precisely, he's highlighting the need to examine those potential consequences. So one area he dives into is family courts, and he argues that the system often favors women, particularly in custody cases, leading to what he calls collateral damage for both fathers and children.
Yeah, he uses some pretty powerful stories to illustrate this point, right?
Yes, he shares the story of Robert, a father who, despite being actively involved in his child's life, lost custody. And then there's the story of Alex, a child caught in the crossfire of a bitter custody battle. These narratives raise questions about whether the current system always serves the best interests of the child.
And speaking of those shifts in family structures, the book also delves into the impact of no-fault divorce laws and suggests that while intended to simplify the process, they might have contributed to a decline in marriage rates and put men at a financial disadvantage.
Yeah, what's interesting here is that he presents data on alimony payments and asset division, arguing that no-fault divorce can often leave men with a significant financial burden.
So it seems like he's suggesting that these laws, while seemingly progressive, might have had some unintended consequences.
Yeah, for men and for the institution of marriage itself.
For the institution of marriage itself, right?
Exactly. And another area he delves into is consent theory and how it's applied within marriage.
Oh, this is where things start to get really interesting. He argues that modern interpretations of consent theory, particularly the idea of ongoing consent, can make men vulnerable even within the supposedly safe confines of marriage.
He uses the phrase manipulation of consent theory to describe how he believes these concepts can be used to control sexual activity within a marriage, potentially leaving men open to accusations even within a committed relationship.
It's a pretty bold statement. It seems like he's suggesting that this focus on consent, while important in many contexts, might need to be carefully considered within the unique dynamics of a marriage.
He's definitely pushing for a more nuanced understanding of how these concepts play out in different relationships. And speaking of societal shifts, the book also connects declining birth rates to the rise of modern feminism.
That's a pretty big claim.
Yeah.
How does he make that connection?
Well, he suggests that the emphasis on career over family, which he links in part to feminist ideals, has contributed to fewer people choosing to have children. And he backs this up with global fertility rate statistics, showing a significant decline in births in many developed nations.
And then there are the abortion statistic. He presents a staggering 70 million globally per year.
It's a huge number.
It seems like he's raising questions about the potential societal impact of such high numbers.
Yeah, this raises some crucial questions. What are the long-term consequences of these demographic trends? He explores potential economic impacts, like labor shortages and strain on social systems as societies age with fewer young people to support them.
And he even delves into potential cultural shifts, suggesting that these trends could lead to a devaluation of family and children within society. It's definitely thought-provoking. And then he takes things in a really unexpected direction drawing a connection between modern feminism and Marxist ideology.
Right, that's one of the more controversial aspects of the book. He argues that certain feminist ideas have been used to advance what he sees as a Marxist agenda, particularly when it comes to restructuring societal power dynamics.
Hold on, feminism and Marxism. That seems like a bit of a jump. Did you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah.
I'm curious how he makes that link.
Sure, he points to how these ideologies intersect in various areas, such as their approaches to family structure, economic systems, and even the use of language. He's not suggesting all feminists are Marxists, but rather that there are parallels between the goals of certain feminist movements and Marxist principles, particularly regarding the redistribution of power.
Okay, so we've got declining birth rates, abortion statistics, and now we're talking about Marxism. This is definitely a deep dive into some complex and potentially controversial territory.
Absolutely, and it gets even more intense as we move into his arguments about the war against men. He contends that a subset of modern feminism is actively demonizing masculinity and devaluing men's roles in society.
And he uses some pretty strong examples to support this claim, right? Things like how men are portrayed in media and the legal system's perceived bias against them.
Exactly. He cites examples of how men are often depicted in sitcoms as bumbling fools or in dramas as the aggressors or villains. He also points to the legal system, specifically custody cases, as an area where he believes men are often treated unfairly.
And he even brings up the issue of false allegations against men, highlighting cases like the Duke Lacrosse case and the allegations against Patrick Brown, where despite ultimately being exonerated, the accused men suffered significant reputational damage.
And these cases, he argues, contribute to a climate of fear and distrust, where men feel constantly under suspicion and vulnerable to false accusations.
And then there's a whole section on the rise of the incel phenomenon, which he links at least in part to the changes brought about by modern feminists.
Right, and this is where your interest in covert contracts comes into play. He suggests that the traditional dynamic between men and women, where men were expected to be providers and protectors and women to be homemakers and caregivers, has been disrupted.
And he argues that this disruption, driven in part by feminist ideals, has left some men feeling lost and unsure of their place in a society with rapidly changing gender roles and expectations.
He believes that these men are struggling to navigate a dating landscape where traditional masculine traits and behaviors are no longer valued or are even seen as unacceptable.
So it seems like he's suggesting that this disconnect between traditional expectations and modern realities is contributing to the frustration and alienation felt by some men.
Precisely, and this sense of being lost is further compounded, he argues, by the educational gap that's emerged between boys and girls.
He points out that boys are now much more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities and are falling behind girls academically.
He attributes this in part to what he calls the feminization of the education system, arguing that teaching methods and curricula are often more suited to girls' learning styles, leaving boys disengaged and struggling to keep up.
And he also highlights the lack of male role models in education, especially in elementary schools where most teachers are women. He suggests that this absence of male influence can make it harder for boys to develop a healthy sense of masculinity and find their place in a world with shifting gender roles.
He even shares a story about John, a personal trainer, who felt confused and uncertain about his role in relationships because of the mixed messages he received about masculinity growing up.
You know, John's experience seems to highlight how these larger societal trends can have very real and personal consequences for individuals trying to navigate these changing landscapes.
Absolutely. This deep dive isn't just about abstract theories and statistics. It's about understanding how these ideas manifest in the lives of real people.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground already, from the evolution of feminism to its impact on everything from family courts and birth rates to the rise of the incel phenomenon and the challenges facing boys in education.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's still much more to unpack as we delve further into the author's arguments and explore the potential consequences of these societal trends.
So before we continue, what are some of the things that have stood out to you so far in our exploration of the unseen damage?
Well, I'm particularly struck by the author's connections between seemingly disparate concepts like feminism and Marxism. You know, it's a reminder that societal changes are rarely isolated events. They're often interconnected in complex ways that we might not immediately recognize.
Yeah, for me, it's the personal stories like those of Robert, Alex, and John that really hit home. They demonstrate how these large-scale societal shifts can have tangible and often painful consequences for individuals navigating their own lives and relationships.
Stories serve as powerful reminders that behind the statistics and theories, there are real human beings grappling with these changes and trying to make sense of their place in a world that's in constant flux. Welcome back. When we left off, we were talking about that idea of a war against men. And the author uses some pretty strong language to make his point. He even uses the term demonization of masculine.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back, that's for sure. He argues that traditional masculine traits are being portrayed negatively, which leads to this kind of distorted and harmful view of men in society.
And he offers a bunch of examples of this, especially in the media, like how men are often shown in sitcoms as being incompetent or foolish, while women are portrayed as strong and capable. And in dramas, men are frequently the aggressors or the villains, perpetuating those negative stereotypes.
He even connects this to a cultural Marxist agenda, suggesting that these portrayals aren't just about entertainment, they reflect deeper ideological currents at play.
Right. It's like these portrayals are being used to push a specific worldview.
Exactly. And this reminds me of your interest in, how societal structures evolve and potentially get co-opted over time.
It's a fascinating connection. He seems to be arguing that these shifts in media representation aren't just about entertainment. They reflect deeper ideological currents at play.
Yeah, and he doesn't just stop at media. He even argues that language itself is being corrupted to promote feminist ideology.
Oh, absolutely. He points to things like the push for gender-neutral pronouns, which he sees as an attempt to erase the distinctions between men and women, and he believes this contributes to a blurring of traditional gender roles and expectations, which he sees as detrimental to a healthy society.
So he's not just talking about the words we use, but the potential consequences of those changes for how we understand gender and relationships.
Exactly. He argues that we need to be mindful of how language can be used to shape our perceptions and potentially even manipulate our understanding of reality.
He also delves into how terms like toxic masculinity are used to label all traditional masculine traits as negative, failing to acknowledge that some of these traits like strength, assertiveness, and a protecting instinct can actually be positive, in the right context.
That's one of his key points, the need for nuance. He's not arguing that all traditional male behaviors are positive or that there aren't harmful aspects of masculinity, but he's advocating for a balanced approach that recognizes both the strengths and weaknesses of traditional gender roles and expectations.
So it's not about going back to some idealized past, but rather about, understanding how to navigate the complexities of modern society while respecting and valuing the positive aspects of traditional masculinity.
Exactly. He's advocating for a redefinition of masculinity, not its eradication. He suggests that a healthy society requires a balance of both masculine and feminine energies.
And this kind of connects back to what he said earlier about the unintended consequences of some societal shifts. It seems like he's suggesting that in the push for gender equality, we might have inadvertently, thrown the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, by demonizing all aspects of traditional masculinity instead of discerning, the good from the bad.
That's a really insightful observation. It's a reminder that progress often requires a delicate balance, and that even well-intentioned efforts can sometimes have unforeseen and even harmful consequences.
So we've talked about the war against men, the corruption of language, the demonization of masculinity. How does the media fit into all of this?
Well, he dedicates a whole chapter to the role of media in shaping societal perceptions of men. And he argues that mainstream media, often driven by what he sees as feminist ideologies, perpetuates negative stereotypes about men contributing to this war against men narrative.
And he provides several examples of this, right? Like how news coverage of domestic violence often portrays men as the perpetrators and women as the victim, even though statistics show that domestic violence can be a more complex issue, with varying dynamics.
Exactly. And he also points to the way men are often portrayed in advertising. They're frequently shown as incompetent fools who need women to come to their rescue, further reinforcing that idea that men are less capable than women.
It's almost as if these portrayals create a self-fulfilling prophecy where men are expected to be incompetent, and then they're criticized for not living up to a standard that's been undermined by those very portrayals.
It's a fascinating and somewhat paradoxical dynamic. And he also connects this to the issue of false allegations against men, which we touched on earlier. He argues that the media often rushes to judgment in these cases, portraying the accused men as guilty before they've had a chance to defend themselves.
He brings up those high-profile examples, again, like the Duke Lacrosse case and the allegations against Patrick Brown, where media coverage really played a significant role in shaping public opinion, even though the accusations were later proven false.
He contends this type of media coverage creates a climate of fear and distrust, where men are afraid to even interact with women for fear of being falsely accused.
It's as if this fear becomes a new form of covert contract, where men feel pressured to avoid certain behaviors or even entire social situations to minimize the risk of false accusation.
That's a really interesting way to connect it back to your initial interest in covert contract. It seems that he's suggesting that this fear itself becomes a new set of unspoken rules governing how men and women interact.
So we've got media portraying men negatively, the legal system often perceived as biased against men, and the education system failing to adequately address the needs of boys. What's the overall impact of all this on men, according to the authors?
He argues that these factors are contributing to a crisis of masculinity. He believes that men are feeling lost, confused, and unsure of their place in a world that increasingly seems hostile towards them.
He cites rising rates of male suicide, depression, and substance abuse as evidence of this crisis, suggesting that these are symptoms of a deeper societal malaise, where men are feeling alienated and disconnected.
And he also points to the rise of the incel phenomenon, which we discussed earlier, as another manifestation of this crisis. He believes that these men are struggling to find their place in a society where traditional male roles and behaviors are no longer valued or are even seen as problematic.
It's a pretty bleak picture he paints. Does he offer any solutions or reasons for hope?
He does. He argues for a rebalancing of the scales, a recognition of the value of masculinity, while also addressing the harmful aspects of traditional male behavior.
No, he's not advocating for a return to some outdated patriarchal system.
No, not at all. He's advocating for a more nuanced approach that recognizes the strengths and contributions of both men and women and seeks to create a society where both genders can thrive.
And what are some of the specific things he suggests we can do to achieve this rebalancing?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of fathers in the lives of children and argues for policies that support fatherhood and encourage men to be more involved in their family. He also suggests that we need to challenge the negative stereotypes about men that are perpetuated in the media and advocate for more balanced and nuanced portrayals that recognize men's strengths and contributions to society.
And he also talks about the need to address the educational gap between boys and girls, right?
Yeah.
It seems like he's suggesting that reforms are needed to better cater to boys' learning styles and interests.
Exactly. He calls for reforms in the education system that would provide more male role models, particularly in the early years, to help boys develop a healthy sense of masculinity and find their place in the world.
This all sounds like it would require a pretty significant societal shift. Do you think it's achievable?
It's definitely a challenging undertaking, but he seems optimistic that it's possible. He ends the book with a call to action, urging men to stand up for their rights, challenge the negative narratives about masculinity, and work towards a more balanced and harmonious society.
And he also encourages men to support each other, to build communities where they can connect and share their experiences, and to work together to create a better future for themselves and their sons. This has been a truly thought-provoking deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground exploring the author's arguments about the impact of feminism on men, relationships, and society as a whole.
And we've delved into some challenging and controversial ideas, but I think it's important to engage with these conversations, even if they make us uncomfortable, because avoiding them won't make them disappear.
That's so true. If we don't talk about these issues, they're likely to fester and potentially worsen over time. Open and honest dialogue is essential if we want to find solutions.
Absolutely. So what does all of this mean? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the unseen damage?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways is that even well-intentioned societal changes can have unintended consequences. We're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the unseen damage. This book has really taken us on a journey from the evolution of feminism and its impact on things like family courts to the decline in birth rates and the rise of the incel phenomenon and even connections to Marxist ideology. It's been a lot.
And let's not forget the author's argument that, a subset of modern feminism is waging this war against men, leading to what he sees as the demonization of masculinity and a crisis of identity for a lot of men in today's world.
It's been a thought-provoking discussion so far.
Okay.
Before we wrap up, there are a couple more things I want to make sure we hit. The issue of false allegations against men and the impact of modern feminism on the education system.
Yeah, both of these issues tie into the author's broader concern about shifts in power dynamics and a growing tendency to view men with suspicion even when they're innocent.
He really dives into several high-profile cases, where men were falsely accused of sexual misconduct, like the Duke lacrosse case and the allegations against Patrick Brown. And he argues that these cases, often fueled by media sensationalism, can really ruin lives, even when the accused are later exonerated. And it reminds me of how you mentioned earlier that societal structures can be co-opted to serve certain interests, potentially leading to injustices.
That's a chilling thought. He suggests that these cases contribute to a culture of fear and distrust, where men become hesitant to even interact with women, fearing those false accusations.
And he even argues that this fear can lead to self-censorship, where men avoid certain professions or social situations just to minimize their risks.
It creates this chilling effect where men feel like they have to walk on eggshells all the time, and that can ultimately harm everyone involved.
Then there's that whole section on the education system where he argues that boys are falling behind.
Right. He presents some pretty striking statistics, like how boys are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and significantly less likely to graduate from college. And he attributes this in part to what he calls the feminization of education.
What exactly does he mean by feminization in this context?
Well, he argues that teaching methods and curricula are often geared toward girls' learning styles, which can leave boys disengaged and struggling to keep up.
He also points to the lack of male role models in education, especially in elementary schools where the vast majority of teachers are women.
Right, and he suggests that this lack of male presence can make it difficult for boys to develop a healthy sense of masculinity and figure out, where they fit in the world.
So taking all of this into account, what are some of the key takeaways you think listeners should really consider after this deep dive into the unseen damage?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that we need to be cautious about making sweeping generalizations and avoid demonizing entire groups of people.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even movements with good intentions can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And achieving true equality requires a nuanced approach that recognizes, both the strengths and challenges of both men and women.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the author's arguments about family courts, birth rates, consent theory, Marxist ideology, the war against men, and the impact of these trends on education and societal perception. It's been an intense but really important journey.
I agree. And while this book raises some challenging and controversial questions, I think it's crucial to have these conversations.
Because ignoring these issues won't make them go away.
Exactly. And the longer we avoid these difficult dialogues, the more likely these problems are to worsen over time.
So as we wrap up, what's one final provocative thought we can leave our listener with? What's something to ponder as they reflect on all we've discussed?
Well, the book focuses primarily on Western society. Have you considered how these trends might manifest differently in other cultures and what alternative perspectives on feminism might exist globally?
That's a great point. It reminds us that there are many different ways to approach gender equality, and what works in one culture may not necessarily work in another.
It's a call to stay curious, keep asking questions, and be open to new perspectives.
Well said. If you're intrigued by the ideas we've explored in this deep dive, you can check out The Unseen Damage on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to delve deeper into these complex and often controversial issues. Until next time, keep those minds open and those questions coming.